Welcome back to the main stage, everyone. As you may have heard throughout the conference, we have work to do as a community to increase diversity, equity, and inclusion in technology, and open source in particular. We are thrilled to hear from our next speaker, Jacqueline Gibson, about addressing inequality in tech for Black people. Jacqueline is a digital equity advocate and software engineer at Microsoft. Welcome, Jacqueline.
Hi, thank you for having me. And like she said, my name is Jacqueline Gibson, and today's talk is titled Shift Left, Addressing Digital Inequity for the Black Community. And before I get started, I'm just going to go ahead and check the Backstage tab, making sure that everyone can hear me and see my slides. Seems that everything should be good. Awesome. So let's go ahead and get into this. So I think a great launching point for this talk is acknowledging that many people celebrate technology as the quote unquote great equalizer. And this is because theoretically, it bridges gaps between ability and knowledge, and it empowers people to achieve what was previously considered impossible. Ultimately, the digital advancements that we've come to love have made education and upward mobility more portable than before. And these benefits are actually what drew me to pursue a career in tech in the first place. That said, after my first few years in the space, it became evident that tech was not really solving issues faced by many underrepresented groups, but especially those faced by the Black community. And so I began to study the intersection of technology and society and race in my academic research, and focusing on the ways that tech as we know it and its predecessors have maintained prejudicial practices that limit the ways that Black people can navigate the world. And what I found was, rather than living up to its role as a disruptive force, technology is enforcing societal norms, exacerbating separations between individuals of different genders, races, and socioeconomic statuses. So instead of closing the gaps between privilege, it tends to widen them instead. And so this quote that I have on the screen from Sophia Imogenoglu really emphasizes how a common oversight by product development teams serves as the root of this problem. And the quote reads, "To design technology for people without detailed and rigorous study of people and communities makes for the many kind of egregious tech designs we see that come at the expense of people of color and women." And to rephrase this, the reason why we see technology continuing to exacerbate the inequalities that are already evident in society is because these products are not designed with underrepresented identities and experiences in mind. So if product teams don't consider our lives and our needs, it's no wonder that the products themselves aren't serving us. And interestingly enough, thinking about this problem space is how I came up with my title for today's talk. So in product delivery, shift left testing requires teams to test earlier in the development cycle. Simply put, it involves an adjustment of perspective and an increase in intentionality, which results in the ability to find and prevent problems earlier. In the accessibility space, we often talk about the need to shift left and bring accessible design and development to the table as early as possible, rather than the current tendency of teams to address accessibility right before a product goes out the door. This approach also proves to be useful when it comes to addressing the accessibility and usability problems for technology for the Black community. If teams would simply consider Black experiences and needs earlier in the product development cycle, they'd be able to create tech that better serves our community. And today we're going to talk about some of these technical decisions that have been made and the consequences of this lack of consideration. And so my hope is that by the end of the session, you'll be able to clearly see the ways that anti-Blackness is replicated in technology and understand the discrepancies the digital divide has created for the Black community. But we won't end there. We'll also discuss what each of us needs to do to ensure a more equitable future for all people. So it's my opinion that the treatment of Black people in relation to technology is derivative of the treatment of Black people in society at large. A perpetual underclass, it's no surprise that Black individuals have not benefited from the technical boom at the same rates as their counterparts of other races. When you try to consider the role that Black people's lack of ascribed humanity plays in their position in the digital world, you're actually forced to view this issue of technical isolation and lack of technical privilege in a different light. And so I invite you to consider the work of scholar Sylvia Winter, who in No Humans Involved discusses the effects of LAPD's use of the NHI label in cases that involved Black youth. This conceptual othering of Black individuals and their lives, she writes, makes it easier to quote unquote judicially lynch those who have been made perceivable as less than human. And so taking this a step further, Being perceived as non-human makes it easier for individuals to justify the other forms of violence that Black individuals have been forced to deal with since we arrived on North American soil in 1619. And with this in mind, it became clear to me that the reasons that Black people are continuously exploited in both the physical and technical sense are the same. There are no serious repercussions for discrimination directed towards the non-human. This idea of being categorized as less than human also brought to mind the concept of thingification, or the categorization of bodies as items rather than as humans. And this came from Martinician scholar Aimé Césaire, who held that colonization and thingification are synonymous. Thingification involves the destruction of entire societies and their histories for the purpose of exploitation and domination. Thus, the stripping of our humanity represents a systematic decision to not only separate us, but to strip us of our agency. And for that reason, it's really important to note the role of the hegemony, or the ability of groups in power to maintain dominance and influence, what that role plays in the current state of technology. So traditionally, white, cisgender, heterosexual men have shaped our ideas of knowledge and intelligence, and the tech space honestly remains no different. And while people optimistically view the internet as being a place for anyone, when you take a step back and you look at the tech industry, you'll see that it has become synonymous with these same privileged identities. And so this means that the creators of technical systems also happen to be the same people who hold power in greater society. And these individuals have a vested interest in maintaining the status quo because their power is intrinsically linked to doing so. And you see this not only in the way that technology is developed, but in the problems that tech professionals choose to solve and prioritize. So it's really in our best interest, or the best interest of hegemonic forces, to continue the thingification of the Black individuals. Because if Black people are considered things, there's no reason why it doesn't make sense to continue to exclude them from the creation process. Because at the end of the day, people create technologies to serve the needs and wants of other people, not the needs and wants of inanimate objects, animals, etc. And so objects exist to be leveraged to accomplish the goals of mankind. But if mankind is overwhelmingly considered to be synonymous with being white, heterosexual, and male, what happens to the rest of us who don't hold those labels? So when it comes to the creation of technology, Black people are often excluded, and when we're considered, it's usually as an afterthought. And while we've often had technology used upon us, or even been the technology ourselves, we rarely have technology created for us with us in mind, or even more importantly, for us by us. An example I want to talk about is the relationship between Black people and film, specifically photography and videography. So for those of you who aren't familiar with this, originally lighting calibration for photographs was based on lighter white skin. And despite major photography companies selling their product as cutting edge technology of the highest quality, Black people will continue to experience discoloration whenever they sought out a photo. And it wasn't actually until the 1970s that Kodak attempted to address this issue of capturing darker colors. But even then, their desire to address this problem was only motivated by their desire to photograph dark objects. So chocolate, mahogany furniture, or even horses. So when the systems that we make are not equitable, there's really no way to prevent the insidious effects of white supremacy from being reproduced into technology. And this is further explained by the fact that Black individuals are not provided opportunities to shape product development at the same rates as their non-Black counterparts. So in the tech field, you continue to see a disparity between the number of Black people in the industry, and even then from the number of Black people who actually work in technical roles in the industry. So shaping and building the products these companies release. And one example is Google's diversity report in 2018, where they reported that approximately 2.5% of their employee pool and 2% of their new hire class identified as Black. Black employees also were noted to have the largest attrition rate of any of the marginalized ethnic identities they were tracking in the study. More recently, in their 2019 Diversity and Inclusion Report, another company, Microsoft, which many of us consider to be a part of the current vanguard of responsible tech, they reported that Black employees made up only 3.3% and 7.5% of technical and non-technical employees, respectively. So I talk about these two examples because I want you to understand that the continued isolation of Black people from active creation of technology is playing a major role in the reasons why we are excluded from benefiting from digital advancements. And so if we don't have a say in creating the technology that decides how we navigate the digital world, how can we exert agency in this space? The answer is that we can't. And so I put this slide here because I know that some of you might have heard everything that I've said over the last few minutes, and you might be wondering about the Black individuals who work alongside you in the tech industry. After all, it seems like I'm hinging my argument on the fact that Black people have absolutely no say in what problems the tech industry chooses to tackle, but surely your Black coworkers must have some say in the way your teams function and your products are developed. And I think with all of that considered, it's fully possible to acknowledge the impact that Black individuals in tech currently have while simultaneously understanding the following. And that is that A, just because there is some Black representation in your team, company, product, field, etc., this doesn't mean that we're equally valued, especially compared to other demographics. And B, knowing everything that I've discussed about anti-Blackness in technology, you should understand that this complicates the realities of Black engineers, product designers, managers, etc. throughout this space. So even if we are present, this doesn't mean that anti-Blackness in technology has been defeated, if you will. And so when I was trying to figure out how I could quantify this concept, I turned to the work of W.B. Du Bois, because when he was trying to quantify the struggles of Black individuals attempting to make their way in society, he coined the term double consciousness. And he used that to refer to the struggle to, quote, balance two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals in one dark body, whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder. And Mark Anthony Neal, another scholar, argues that this idea of double consciousness can also be extended to describe the complicated relationship that Black individuals have with technology. So for us, it's more than really having to reconcile our Blackness that is at war with a white society. We're also tasked with reconciling the idea that technology is used both by and on us. And this leads to questions of what it means to understand who you are as a Black individual, and also understand the ways in which white people view you in the digital and the physical. And so particularly, we need to consider how our position in the increasingly digital world complicates this understanding. And Black people already know that our position in society is complicated by how we are viewed and how white society chooses to limit us. Being excluded from the technical world exemplifies the lack of autonomy that's already afforded to us as we are attempting to navigate the world. And this consistently low representation of Black technical creators that I was talking about previously, and I'm sure most of you have witnessed by being in the technical spaces, that further underscores the industry's lack of interest in rectifying this issue. And so if we can't equally access technical resources and we remain excluded from technical spaces, we're stripped of another form of flexibility that our more privileged counterparts have. And so moving forward from this, one could argue that for Black technical individuals, so software developers, engineers, we're forced to resolve the conflicts between our identities as Black people, as well as technology creators. And this is much deeper than imposter syndrome. It's not simply a question of, am I good enough to be here? There is an internal strife that comes with being part of the digital vanguard that's tasked with automating the world and bringing equality when you belong to a marginalized group whose people continue to be disenfranchised at the hands of technology that the rest of the world is applauding. And so you have to deal with anti-Blackness on a societal level, anti-Blackness in your industry, and anti-Blackness at the hands of the software your teams create. And so on that note of access and agency, we need to also address the concept of the digital divide, which is a phenomenon that shapes the way that technology is developed, used, and shared. As we become increasingly reliant on technology, the issues of technical accessibility become even more apparent. And through the separation of the world into those who are digitally adept and digitally inept, the latter find themselves categorized as an underclass in society, with Black individuals on average tending to have less technical assets and less skills than their white counterparts. This separation is even further amplified when race is taken into consideration. less technical skills. And so the phenomenon affects Black people's interactions with technology at all levels, because it's shaping not only their ability to use technology daily, but also our chances to create it for ourselves. And so traditionally, the digital divide has been used to categorize these different technical experiences of the haves, so people with devices, and the have-nots, people without. But to truly understand the effect that this has on Black individuals, we need to parse deeper than this. Using this narrow definition of access, it really leads to the perspective that the digital divide conversation should also center solutions related to access. So getting at the problems of, do you have internet at home? No, we'll get you that. Do you have a smartphone? No, okay, we'll get you one, etc. And while access is a huge problem that contributes to the divide, it's not the only factor. So I actually argue in favor of an expanded definition that takes into consideration differences in both digital and algorithmic literacy across different social, ethnic, and national groups. Because it's more than just opening a door and getting technical tools into the hands of marginalized groups. Because simply having the tools in your hand doesn't mean that you can use them well or even understand how these systems function. To be able to do both of those things, this is where the idea of literacy comes into play. So digital literacy is defined as a person's ability to perform tasks effectively in a digital environment. And this includes that person's ability not only to just read and interpret media and reproduce data and images, but also to evaluate and apply new knowledge gained from being in the digital environments. So together, lack of access to technology and related resources to develop necessary skills to use those said technologies, those are key problems that contribute to technical disempowerment in the Black community. And taking it a step further, many individuals in society suffer from algorithmic illiteracy, which is a dangerous position as we continue to rely more and more on programs to govern our lives. Algorithmic literacy, or the knowledge of technical aspects and the ability to critique, it's important to note, and the ability to critique computer programming code that underlies these systems, that is just as important as access and the ability to use the tools. Those who understand technology, they have the ability to leverage that rare commodity of their knowledge to gain and maintain power in society. So the ability to understand the workings of a system, as opposed to simply being able to use it to accomplish goals, that's what distinguishes really creators from skilled workers who use the tools. And this even further separates those people from people who are tasked with solely assembling the technology. And so I want us to sit with these two definitions for a minute, because I think if we're truly going to have a conversation, right, about the contemporary state of Blackness in technology, we need to pull the curtain back and analyze historical context that has resulted in the current state of affairs. Too often, when I have these conversations with people, they tend to use a deficit perspective when discussing the plights of the Black community. And that is to say that they fault Black individuals by citing their perceived shortcomings. So they assume that we are more likely to be digitally illiterate because we lack the natural skill, or we don't know how to code, or we don't have access to the internet, and we don't have wealth to afford private coding tutors for our children, any of these other things, right? And they'll harp on these specific issues rather than acknowledge societal factors that have put us in this situation in the first place. And I want to be clear when I'm talking about this, I'm not saying that these cited obstacles and biased assumptions should be ignored, because all of them are active issues that we need to work to address. But trying to solve these problems without considering the greater societal forces at play results in fixes that are metaphorically equivalent to placing a Band-Aid on the bullet wound. They're just not enough. So all of that said, the questions of who has access, who has the skills, who has the understanding, these are all influenced by the role of power in society. The hegemonic forces of our society shape the disproportion that fuels the digital divide, and these forces are undoubtedly related to sociocultural and economic issues. Technology is a tool, and keeping a monopoly on who enters the space, who profits from it, who can leverage this tool, this is a way for those in power to maintain their hold on society. And knowing the ways the technology functions and how to use that to your advantage, that's how groups maintain their power. And this is why algorithmic literacy is so key. And the most important aspect of algorithmic literacy is understanding the limitations of algorithms and, honestly, technology in general. Knowing how they function under the hood, so to speak, is why it's important that people not only know how to use technology, but know all these other things and have algorithmic literacy. And so the problem of algorithmic literacy is something that we as Black people need to navigate technology properly on a daily basis, but also something that we need entrenched on a societal level to prevent our continued disenfranchisement at the hands of the powers that be. And so an example that highlights the importance of this skill is the case of Beware Software in Fresno, California. Creators of the software leveraged the mounting fear that was surrounding physical risk to police in the aftermath of Ferguson and some other similar protests. And despite these risks actually being at a historic low, they were able to sell the city a software that helped them identify threat rates to police in the line of duty. However, the factors that went into determining the rate of risk, they were never fully explained to city officials or the law enforcement users. And instead, they were withheld by the vendor and cited as proprietary data. And when the officers revealed the fact that they had no comprehensive understanding of the software's rating system, the city council was actually forced to basically vote out use of the software and no longer approve the use of it in the city of Fresno. And so this case is alarming, not only because of the demonstrated importance of algorithmic literacy, so understanding how a software you're choosing to rely on actually works, but because it demonstrates how easily people are willing to rely on quote unquote objective software without knowing what it actually can or cannot do. And so another important example was a study conducted by the Human Rights Data Analysis Group, and that was surrounding police departments that employed a specific predictive policing software called Predpol. And the study exposed the police departments that relied on Predpol for drug arrests in the Oakland area found forces highly concentrated on two predominantly non-white and low-income areas. This occurred consistently despite documentation that drug use was more equally distributed across the city and in other areas that had different socioeconomic, demographics. And so this behavior was a direct result of the fact that rather than correct for biases, the Predpol model reinforced existing patterns that had already existed in this historical police data. And by training off of arrest reports and other documentation where racial biases had influenced higher police interactions in these communities, Predpol created essentially a self-fulfilling prophecy. And this resulted in continuous flagging of these communities as being more high risk, and these communities continue to experience higher drug arrest rates. And so this is important because it shows that no matter how impartial a system may seem to be, if the data on which it is trained is flawed, the algorithm will reflect these biases and flaws. Understanding this moves our conversations away from bemoaning seemingly isolated technical failings of systems and thinking, oh, this algorithm just happened to just have problems. It's fine. Like if we could train it, it'll be fine. It'll be perfectly impartial. No, you actually need to highlight deeper systemic issues that are happening when you don't improve the data you're using for these algorithms. So understanding how these algorithms can reinforce past discriminatory practices, that's vital in moving tech forward to have a more equitable reality. So all of that said, it is crucial for our Blackness to be centered in technical development, because when technologies fail to work for Black people, it's not only extremely frustrating, but it's representative of a larger societal issue. In her book, Dark Matters, Dr. Simone Brown, she presents the idea that a main purpose of several forms of technology is to be able to detect where a person is present. And so if you operate from this perspective, you would then understand that when technologies fail to recognize Black people, they're effectively saying that Black bodies are not there, or at least that they don't matter. So indifference to the Black experience in technical development is not a step forward from active discrimination. It's just the same discrimination repackaged. And so this is the problem with some solutions that I've seen people discuss in the space where they're trying to remove race and just focus on kind of what we like to call a colorblind solution. Because attempting to remove race from the equation really erases the potential to have equity in evaluation. So you might be asking now that I've said all of these things, what is it that we can do? How can we move forward? And I think that there are several steps that technology industry can take moving forward, and I've identified my favorite top 3. So the first one is really to reframe perspectives when it comes to developing these technologies, and especially when we're talking to people who are utilizing classifiers and predictive algorithms, we need to urge them to reframe their perspective. And so we need to ask these teams who are creating these softwares the following question: how will the increased reliance on predictive analysis employed by your tools continue disenfranchisement of Black individuals? Let them sit with it. But I say this kind of as a joke, but honestly, creators need to account for the fact that relying on historical data does a disservice to our community because it's replicating current social biases in seemingly impartial systems. And so we need to ask ourselves, what would it look like to center Blackness in the development of these types of softwares? What do equitable and fair algorithms and predictive software for social management, what do those look like? Personally, I think this means the end of algorithms for predictive policing. So getting rid of surveillance tools and recidivism prediction instruments, the latter being something that I could go on a rant on for like 5 minutes if you let me. But instead, I think we should look to employ predictive algorithms to generate rehabilitative sentencing and treatment options for previously criminalized behaviors. And the latter is really kind of important because right now we're having a lot of conversations as a country about prison and policing abolition. And with that reality being currently at our fingertips or something that could happen, I think now is honestly the perfect time to consider what opportunities do we have to use technology to reinforce safer and sustainable ways to support our communities. Furthermore, whatever we do, we need actual changes that address the issues at hand. And so pulling from popular culture, which if you know me, it's something I love to do, there's this TV show called Better Off Ted, and they have this one episode titled Racial Sensitivity. And in that episode, the Viridian Corporation is forced to grapple with the fact that their motion sensors can't detect darker skin. For that reason, none of their Black employees are actually able to navigate the office. And when they're confronted by the Black employees with an accusation of whether the sensors inaccuracies are a form of racism, the one executive in the room's response is that the technology is quote unquote not targeting Black people, it's just ignoring them. The worst people can call it is indifferent. And so rather than fix the sensors, the company opts to give each Black employee their own personal white guy who's tasked with following their Black individual everywhere and activating sensors on their behalf. Shenanigans ensue, typical sitcom stuff. And so although this is a humorous take, this episode underscores the fact that when faced with repercussions of excluding Black people from the creation of technology, it's just completely inane for companies to refuse to create permanent fixes. Doing so results in no actual progress and doesn't allow us to feel as if our voices and opinions are heard. Ultimately, this is what brings me to our third point, which is why it's important that we carve a space for Black individuals in the world of technology. It's not enough for there simply to be Black bodies in these companies or a sprinkling of Black engineers or product designers. It's also not enough that ads sometimes feature Black consumers or that there are coding camps for Black students. Without conscious creation and freedom of expression, these solutions are simply tools by which white supremacy is reinforced. They opt for tokenism or quick fixes rather than addressing the vast inequality that exists in the digital world. Our society lacks equity, and until we do something about it, so will our technology. So in closing, it's important that we all recognize technology is at the end of the day a tool which can be utilized for good and pushed for equity. But right now, Black people do not control the tools, and we're at an impasse regarding our ability to leverage technology in ways that are progressive, liberating, and most importantly, challenge rather than replicate current systems of domination in society. Truth be told, the issues of the digital and algorithmic literacy are two of the most pressing problems facing the community right now. And if we as a people do not have the same stake in technical creation, how can we ensure that our community is able to leverage technology as the same level of our more privileged counterparts? Once again, unfortunately, the answer is just that we can't. And so since we can't do that, it's no wonder that so many of today's technologies continue to fail us. Without proper checks and balances in place, there's no way for society to prevent biases from permeating into the systems that humans create. And as a result, the relationship that Black individuals have with technology and technical spaces mirrors the problems that we have in society. This is why we need funding and support for accessible resources dedicated to both digital and algorithmic literacy education. This is also why we need technical development teams held accountable for failing to consider how Black lived experiences will be affected by their technology. This is also why we should take advantage of society's current state and push forward conversations on how we can use technology to create equitable and safer futures for Black people everywhere. This is why it's increasingly important that we ensure the companies are actually addressing the issues at hand, not just releasing statements that support the existence of Black individuals without backing up their words with actions. This is why we need space for Black creators, developers, product managers, and founders throughout the technology industry. What we need is more awareness of the issues I discussed in this talk. Understanding the plights of Black individuals throughout society and how tech has continued to be complicit with anti-Blackness, these are all very important steps in this journey, but awareness is not going to be enough. We also need action. So it's in the best interest of the industry and society, if we're being honest, to take this knowledge and reconsider the ways that we develop tech. The onus is on everyone in this room because we hold the keys to the major technical advancements that can reshape society as we now know it. So the biggest question that we face moving forward is whether or not digital spaces can serve as a platform for liberation. And I strongly believe the answer is yes. But this can only be accomplished if we remove barriers to entry that's faced by all marginalized people who try to access these spaces. Equity. It needs to be centered in future development practices to ensure accessibility not only for Black consumers, but any consumers that have a marginalized identity. But focusing on marginalized consumers is not enough, because unless we have a voice in the creation process, this technology will never serve us in the ways that we need it to. Ultimately, if we want to see tech achieve its goal of being the great equalizer, we need disruption. For disruption to properly occur, hegemony must be checked. And for hegemony to be properly dismantled, we need to ensure that decisions are made for us, by us. So at the end of the day, we can't wait to consider these decisions at the last minute when products are about to be shipped, or even worse, when they're already out of the door. We need a conscious adjustment of perspectives, and we need equitable thinking from the start. So thank you for listening. I hope that you guys were able to enjoy this talk, take away some great points to either take to your jobs, talk to friends in tech, think about what we can do better. This is my Twitter handle at @this_is_JCG. If you'd like to tweet at me, let me know what you thought about the talk. You can also connect with me on LinkedIn. It's just my full name, Jacqueline Gibson. These are my citations. And I think, yes, we should have time to do some questions. So let me switch focus, switch gears, and let's see some questions we have. Okay, so first question we have from the audience is, we've often celebrated the Drupal open source community as a duocracy. What specific problems do you think this would create in terms of equity and inclusion? Sorry, talking for 30 minutes takes away your voice. Okay, so I might be wrong. I'm interpreting duocracy to be basically a meritocracy, where you're saying that you value people who are able to do the things, anyone who can do the things, like obviously they can succeed. Is that it? I don't know if it's possible for me to get more context on that. Yes, okay, awesome, thank you. And so if you're talking about the meritocracy, the problem with that is that it assumes that everyone who does so because they can, and it's on their own merits alone. They have the natural knowledge, ability, etc., but it doesn't account for the fact of the access issues I was talking about. So just because someone's not able to do something, that doesn't mean that they didn't have the knowledge and the skills to do so. It could be many things. Maybe they didn't have access to a computer growing up, so they weren't able to go to coding camps since they were 8 years old and already be able to build a website by the time they were 17. So they got into a computer science program at a top 10 school, blah, blah, blah. So we go, and now here they are killing it in open source. So I think it's nice to have a duocracy if you're thinking about the fact that you're lowering the barriers, right? To let anyone who has a desire and has the time and is working to do something, they can be able to thrive in your spaces. But you also need to make sure that when you're pushing for a duocracy, right, you're also trying to consider what are some societal barriers that could have prevented other people from being here? How can we as Drupal, right? As a Drupal community, how can we focus on fighting some of those barriers, moving forward, increasing access to these spaces that allow people to be able to contribute and stuff like that. I hope that that answered the question. Okay, let's see. All right, other question that we have. How does open source technology, oh, it scrolled. Okay, how does open source technology specifically perpetuate the systems of white supremacy, access to the people, knowledge networks to contribute to open source projects? So I would say it kind of ties back to the cultural and social capital that a lot of people in privileged backgrounds have, and being able to leverage that allows them to contribute to open source. Let me try to like make this make more sense. But basically, I think that open source is great in theory because it allows anyone from anywhere. You don't have to have a certain job, degree, anything. You just have to have the ability to code, to push to Git or wherever else it's hosted, and you can contribute to a project and make impact. But once again, kind of similar to what I was talking about with the duocracy, right? You have to make sure that when you're creating open source projects, so if you're a host yourself, make sure that you also have some practices in place where you're supporting people who might not necessarily be like a JavaScript knob, like they know everything about JavaScript, right? You should make sure that you have like some good issues that are great for beginners. Make sure that you have something there that are supporting people who might be new to the space, who might be uncomfortable with trying to figure out how to push themselves. Have some of that in place. I think that would actually make open source to be a little bit more equitable. An example of a repo that's open source that I know that does this really well is the self-defined web app. It's a website where people can contribute different definitions that are related to different social, cultural terms, etc. And what they do is they actively identify this is a great issue for beginning people. They have comprehensive documentation where they'll guide you through what you need to do to be able to create your first pull request. And it's not even just for people that are technical, it's for people that may have never used GitHub before. And so if you have some of these things there, I think that would help make your open source communities even more equitable. Okay. Do you have suggestions for people who are team members and not leaders? So developers, designers, project managers, etc. Yes, I would say that if you're a team member and you look around and everyone on your team came from the same couple of schools, you look the same, you have similar backgrounds, similar like hobbies, everything, like it's very culturally monotonous. I think that you should feel empowered to go to the people who are making decisions on behalf of your team, be it from hiring, developing culture, etc., and push them on what you guys can do to bring more diverse perspectives and lived experiences to the table. And outside of that, I think it's also something you can do to work as an individual to make a team culture that welcomes diversity of opinion and includes, so not just we want to bring it here, but then like if you don't watch Game of Thrones, you don't fit into the team, like nothing like that. But creating an inclusive team culture, I think that starts actually with the employees, not necessarily the manager. So if you find issues or you feel that your team culture or product culture, company culture, etc., is lacking, I think that you should feel empowered to start making some changes, and then also try to hold your leaders' feet to the fire so they'll also make changes as well. Okay. Oh, I think I actually misunderstood duocracy. I'm sorry, I'm going to come back to that. But for the meritocracy part, I hope that answered your question. But let's see. Do you think accessibility in the terms you've defined should be regulated and organizations held to a set of standards? Or should organizations be left to adopt better practices organically? So this is interesting because I've actually talked to a couple of people about what it would be like to have a set of standards to guide some of the problems I was talking about. So specifically with algorithms being trained, data science, machine learning, something like that, having some industry-wide standards that require that you must train on data with like this percentage level of diversity. So it can't just be like, oh, I am, say, a white male, and everyone on my like development team, they're white men, and we train the data on our pictures, so it should be ready to go. That's actually a real case. I'm not going to list which team and product did that, but it's a real thing that happens. And so I think having some industry-wide standard would actually be really helpful, because unfortunately, I think if there is no standardization, there's no way that we can ensure that everyone is adopting these policies at the rate that they should be. I mean, we could hope that people organically realize, it's important that I don't just test things on myself and make sure it works for me. I got to make sure it works for other people. But time and time again, we've seen that that's not the case. So yes, to the person that asked me that, I think that having a set of standards and regulations would be really helpful. What that would look like, what organization that would come out of, I'm not sure. But I think it's a conversation that we should maybe start having in 2020 and see what that could look like. Okay, let's see. Are there any other questions? Did I get to them? Okay. Back to the duocracy, I want to read the correct definition in case anyone else didn't know. It's an organizational structure in which individuals choose roles and tasks for themselves and execute them. Responsibilities attached to people who do the work rather than elected selected officials. And so talking about equity from that perspective, ideally, everyone would know about every opportunity and they would apply for those opportunities and people would choose the things that fit to their abilities, their skill set, et cetera. But unfortunately, the reality, especially as underrepresented identities, sometimes there are things that are kept within, for lack of better words, the boys club. And so you might not know about all the opportunities, or perhaps you could suffer from imposter syndrome and you would not push yourself to have this opportunity. And so I think in a duocracy, it's important to continue to empower people to choose the task and the roles that fit them, but also make sure that you have in place advisors, mentors, et cetera, some kind of structure that are pushing people when they're not necessarily pushing themselves, if that makes any sense. So for example, there was a case when I was in college where I didn't want to push myself to do this research project. I didn't think necessarily I could do it. I was scared. I was like, I'm interested. I've done some similar stuff, but I don't know. And I had a mentor actually come to me and say, hey, I need you to not be in your head. You have the ability, you have the knowledge, you have the skills. Go for it, do it. They pushed me to do that and I ended up being very successful. And so I think in a duocracy, you might have some situations like that where someone is like, I don't know if I should do it, blah. But if you have people that are pushing people, especially from underrepresented identities who tend to undersell ourselves because of imposter syndrome and the world continuously telling us that we're not that valuable, I think that's helpful. Okay, last question, I think. Maybe, how can we let kids of color know that working in technology is a possibility? So I think one thing you can do, obviously, is work in your communities and work with groups that work with disproportionately, a lot of times, kids of color. And you can go and be the representation that they need to see. And you can go and show them, hey, I'm a software engineer. These are things that I do, et cetera. So if you can volunteer with your Girl Scout troop, or you can go to summer camps like, I don't know, I think like the Y has summer camp, stuff like that. Like maybe you could approach, in this example, your local YMCA. If you know this YMCA is in like a community of color and you're like, hey, I'm a software engineer at insert company, and I'd like to be able to come talk to your summer camp and tell them about what I do. Go there and explain to them about what you do, why it's cool, answer questions, and give them your contact information. Like that's one really simple way you can do that. Obviously, to be super effective, it needs to be on a larger scale. But I think if all of us try to take the time, right, to reach out to kids in our communities and show them what we do, how this is amazing, and also how technology relates to all aspects of their lives, that would encourage a lot of people to pursue careers in tech. Because a lot of people don't understand the versatility of development and what you can do. So for example, from my own life, I used to do outreach in Austin with young boys in high school. And a lot of them had passion with like music, sports, tech, like music and sports specifically. And they're like, well, what would I do with technology? And so some of them were really excited to know that like there's music technology. If you like comics, you can go into animation. And so learning about some of these different tools and knowing that it's not just, oh, if you are a coder, you go and you sit and you code in a dark room and you don't talk to anyone. Like knowing that you can take technology and apply it to all these different industries, that often empowers people to think about tech differently and also to consider seeing themselves in it. And if I'm being honest, if I didn't really know about the intersections between like technology for good, so social technology and stuff like that, like if I hadn't learned about that when I was a sophomore in high school, I wouldn't be sitting in front of you today. I was solely interested in international relations and doing some things there and doing community empowerment work. And then when I took a web class and I learned how you could use web technology to support communities and nonprofits and other things like that, and learned more about that, that's when I began to see myself potentially as a computer scientist. And ultimately, that work led me to accessibility, being a software engineer, and digital equity work, which is honestly the reason I'm talking to you today. So I hope that answered the question. Yeah, I hope so. Okay, cool. I'm glad it did. Awesome. Okay, so I think, does anyone else have any questions? I'm an open book. I'm ready to answer.
I think we're good, Jacqueline. I think we're about to wrap up. So I just wanted to hop on really quick and just say thank you so much for your presentation today and for answering those questions at the end for us as well. But yeah, we'll be seeing you. I think people can find you in Hopin and ping you directly if they have any additional questions. But on that note, we will say thank you, and I'm going to stop broadcasting. Thanks for joining us.